this is testing a tape which will be used to interview Gordon Sinykin, July 17th, 1985.
All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. I am in my office, in the conference room in my law office with Ruth Doyle, and we're talking about my early years.
I would like, Gordon, to have you tell us a little bit about your family, your parents, and where they came from, and where you always lived in Madison, I gather. Something about your sisters, and then we want to talk about you.
I was born in Madison on June 18th, 1910, on the second floor of a very small house at 522 South Park Street, and the house is still there, and I pass it often. My folks came from the state of Minsk, or White Russia, during the latter part of the 19th century, sometime between 1890 and 1895. And they came to New York. They had lived in New York for a while. My mother was a seamstress, and my father ran a small lunch counter.
Did they come together?
They came together, yes. And then they moved to Madison before or about the turn of the century.
Why did they come to Madison?
Well, the conditions in New York were very bad. They had gone through quite a recession, a depression there. And my eldest sister, Ida, was born there, and things were very difficult. Some of the Synagogos had come out here to Madison and to Lake Mills and Ripon, and they wrote that there were opportunities out here.
Were they friends of your family?
They were relatives.
Oh, relatives. I
They
didn't
were
realize.
relatives. The Synagogos and the Sinykins are related, and
Is that conceivably the same name to begin with?
that is the name originally was, our name was Sinykin, with an AI in the middle instead of a Y. And it comes from the word Sinai, with the common ending in Russia of K-I-N or K-O. In some areas, the ending was K-I-N, the common ending was K-I-N, and in others, it was K-O. The Sinykins, the Sinykins, came from a tiny, tiny village called Shemezevet in the state of Minsk. The Synagogos came from a nearby larger village, but they were related, and in fact, our grandfathers were brothers. So, my folks came to Madison, and my other two sisters were born here in Madison, and of course I was born subsequently. I was the youngest of a family of four, three sisters who were older than I was.
Who idolized you, I imagine.
Well, I don't know about that.
The baby brother always seems to come.
Anyhow, you want to ask me questions? Or?
No, I think this is very interesting. But after a while, I do want to talk a little bit about the neighborhood. the bush area that you grew up in. But I think this is fascinating now.
So we lived I was born in this little house on Park Street, and thereafter, and I can't remember anything about that. At a very early age, we moved to a house on Milton Street between Park Street and Murray Street. And after living there for several years, my father bought an old house and moved it to 106 South Murray Street.
There was a great deal of house moving in those days, wasn't there?
In those days, Ruth, it was common to buy a house and to move it from one location to another. So this house was moved to 106 South Murray Street. My father was a junk dealer, and that was a very hard way to make a living. And I can recall big piles of junk in our yard during World War I, which he finally sold. And he came down with the flu. There was an epidemic of flu during World War I. And he was very sick as a result. Later this developed into tuberculosis. So we had a very serious situation.
I had that too. My father had tuberculosis.
Is that so?
At the same time, yeah.
Yeah. And we couldn't afford to put him in a sanitarium. So we kept him isolated in the house, but he still worked, and he changed from a junk peddler to a peddler of fruit and vegetables. And he had a horse and a wagon, and I used to, from a very early age on, I used to help in this peddling. I would go in the summertime. I would meet him on days when he was on the east side. I would take a streetcar from that area.
From home?
Mill Street, on Mill Street. Go to Mill Street. I'd bring a basket of lunch that my mother would prepare for him. And I'd get on a streetcar and I'd go over to the east side and meet him there, and I'd work with him the rest of the day. On the days when he was on the west side, I would either meet him or he would come home for lunch.
Where did he get the fruits and vegetables? He didn't raise all that.
No, these were purchased from a wholesale fruit and vegetable house known as the J.H. Halprin Company, Heilprin, which was located on the railroad tracks, the Illinois Railroad tracks, and Bedford Street and Washington Avenue. And so this is what I would do during my early years, say from about 10 years of age till about 14 or 15.
During vacations, I see.
During vacations.
Yeah. Where did you go to school? Did you go to the
I went to
Longfellow
Longfellow School. My elementary schooling was at Longfellow School, and I have a debt of gratitude which I will never forget to the teachers of Longfellow School, because they were very unusual in their attention, in their interest, and in their energy in educating us. And
Probably was really exciting for them to have students like the Sinykin kids in class.
they were sometimes very strict, and they wouldn't let us get away with anything. Have quite a feeling for them because they really drummed English and grammar and arithmetic, and they encouraged us so much to read. I'll never forget my fifth grade teacher, Miss Evans from Mankato, Minnesota. And I just adored her because she was so interesting and inspiring. And I'll never forget the reading that she used to do. She used to read out loud to us every day for a half hour or so. She was a marvelous reader, and we all looked forward to that period. But she gave me some special time and effort, and I did a number of things. As a result, I felt that inspiration from her.
Did you speak English at home? Did your parents speak English?
Oh yes, we spoke English at home. We spoke English. My parents, of course, also spoke Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
But
But your language in the house was not Yiddish, but
it was
English.
It was English.
Mm-hmm. That's a big help to all the children.
But I remember my interest in reading, and I would on Saturdays, I would have my mother fix me a sandwich in a brown bag, and I would walk downtown to the library, the city library, and spend the whole day at the city library over here in the corner of Dayton and Carroll Street. And I would stop for lunch. I would take off for lunch, but I'd spend the whole day reading.
I gather your folks weren't religious in the traditional sense.
They were not, well, they were religious, but I took Hebrew lessons.
Were you affiliated with the temple that was in the Bush area?
Yes, and we were members of the congregation of the Orthodox Synagogue there, known as Agudas Achim.
Mm-hmm.
And but
they didn't foreclose you from going to the library on Saturday?
Oh, no. My folks were not overly religious or observant, except on the various important holidays.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother did keep a kosher house, so there were separate dishes for the meat meals and for what we call the dairy meals.
Mm-hmm. Were there many many Jewish people in the bush at that time?
Oh yes, yes.
I've mentioned to you before, I think, some conversations with black people from that area and Italian people, and what a wonderful sort of integration apparently existed there.
Yeah.
People did not resent each other. And the Jewish people took leadership roles, and nobody...
Yeah, there were, in the Ninth Ward, in this part of the Ninth Ward, let's say, so-called Bush, there were Jews, there were Italians, and there were blacks. And we played with them, we lived with them, we had them in our house, and there wasn't any discrimination, except perhaps some on a religious basis.
Mm-hmm. The Catholics and the Jews.
Catholics and the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that reared its head. But
You didn't, I gather, didn't grow up with that feeling.
I didn't grow up with any feeling
Mhm.
of prejudice, no. No. And blacks, you play with them all the time. And blacks in my house frequently. And
That's what I was told, is that your mother was very cordial to people and that they visited her and everybody liked her.
My mother was a very strong personality. She was very warm and outgoing. And she really poured everything within her being into me. She used to sit there and talk to me, even when I was a little kid, as if I was a mature adult.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about standards of life, of goals, of what I should be thinking about, what I should be aiming for. And
isn't it remarkable that she knew what you should be aiming for?
yeah.
She must have been quite sophisticated, too.
And she could get me to do anything. I adored her, and she was an inspiration constantly to me, but she didn't live very long during my life. She died when I had just turned 16.
What happened to her?
Well, she'd been ailing for a long time. She had problems with her stomach, her abdomen, and these were ongoing problems. And finally she had surgery, very serious surgery. And I remember a doctor was Dr. Joe Dane.
Mm-hmm.
And she did not recover from this operation. I don't know to this day whether it was cancer or what it was. But
they didn't know themselves.
no,
But your father lived.
Lived a few years. He lived. My mother died in 1926 at the age of 52. My father died in 1932 at the age of 59.
Oh, goodness.
And
So your sisters raised you. Did they keep the family together?
yes, we were together. We continued to live at 106 South Murray Street until after my father's death. And then we sold the house. We rented it and then sold it. And I finished up living in a little place on campus here. And of course by that time I was in university when my father died. But
You're a strong man yourself, Gordon.
well,
As strong as your mother. But wouldn't she be proud of all that you've accomplished in these many years that you've been in on everything
Yeah.
that's gone on in Madison?
yeah. And
And apparently she had taught you a lot of lessons even at an early age. that
she
you
gave
carried.
me some wonderful instruction about life and about goals and about how one must live and conduct himself. She poured her whole spirit into me.
So that you didn't really die.
No.
It's hard to realize, but it's true. One of your former neighbors has told me about always seeing you with a violin case. And we talked about this a little before, but I think it should be on the tape, about your interest in music and the violin.
Well, I think it was about at the age of 10. I had been interested in the violin for some time and kept talking about it. So my folks took me down to the Wisconsin School of Music and bought me a violin and started me taking lessons.
that must have represented a major investment.
That was a big investment.
I gather they were people of small income.
Oh, very, very, very small income. I didn't realize how poor we were. Everything was patched together, but I thought everything was wonderful.
Sure.
We always had enough food, and it was always seemed to me. My mother was a great cook, and we all appreciated that. But it was really very, very tough going. We never had hot water, for example, except to take a bath on Saturdays. So
but the people in your neighborhood were in similar circumstances.
they were all in similar circumstances. Yes.
So you didn't have any feeling of being different or
Right.
deprived.
And
But let's get back to the violin.
so I
interrupted you.
started out taking lessons, and I finally came to Frank Bach, B-A-C-H, and took lessons from him. And he had an orchestra of about, let's say, 35 pieces of musicians from all over the city that he had collected. And we used to practice once a week in his flat in the 600 block of University Avenue. And we used to play all the classical music, all the symphonies. And we used to work hard in these rehearsals. And we used to play at various concerts and various events in various places.
Who supported this orchestra financially? Did you?
Well, we were all volunteers.
So there wasn't any
There
expense.
wasn't any expense.
And Mr. Bach did it as a volunteer too.
And he did it as a volunteer too. He, of course, was teaching lessons to the violin and violinists and the cellists. So he was getting some income out of that. But otherwise he didn't get paid especially for this. And when we'd go out of town, the parents would get together, those who had cars. We never had a car, by the way. Our family never had an automobile. They would get together with their cars and they would transport us to Milwaukee or to wherever it was that we went for the concert. So this is very much part of my life, is music and the violin. Although, as I had mentioned to you before going on this microphone, I didn't have a good ear, so I couldn't become a good violinist. But I could play better. I could do better with an orchestra where I could hear the melody from the other members of the orchestra. And when I got into high school, I played in the high school orchestra, and eventually I ended up as the concertmaster of the orchestra of Madison Central High School.
Give me just a second. You know what I think of it? I think that's turned out. Terrible.
In high school, a pianist was David Welton, now a doctor.
In Madison?
No, he went, I think he's in North Carolina. And Walter Ela played the flute. He later married Janet Smith. And we used to, this trio would go out and play.
That's a wonderful
various
combination, the strings and the
events,
flute.
churches and all sorts of different places. And that was a lot of fun.
Did Mr. Bach teach that too?
No, this was the director of the high school orchestra, Paul Sanders, taught that. And he became an especially good friend of mine. And I kept in touch with him until he left Madison. In recent years, he came back to Madison. He spent quite a bit of time in Hawaii with the orchestra there at McKinley High School. Came back here. He died about 2 years ago. He was living up on the Wisconsin River near where we have a cottage, and I used to see him
Isn't that
from
interesting?
time to time. He was a marvelous person.
You put your violin away at some point, I guess.
Well, when I got into college, a whole new world opened up. I used to say the university here was, to me, like being at the World's Fair every day. There was so much to do, so much to see, so much to hear, so many interesting people to get to know. And I just didn't have time to spend on the violin, so I gradually stopped playing the violin.
I gather you were always a very good student in
Yes, I was.
grade school, and apparently enjoyed school enormously.
Yes, I did. And from grade school, I went for a year and a half to junior high school at Randolph School.
Mm-hmm. Was that a junior high then?
Yes, at that time. And from there, I went to Central High School, and I particularly enjoyed Central High School, enjoyed the teachers there very much. And, of course, then went on. I took one summer school session at Wisconsin High School, which is no longer in existence. But I did that so I could complete my high school graduation in 3.5 years. And then went on to university, and of course that was a new world and a very fascinating world. I worked hard, and I did get very good grades, as you can see from the scrapbook.
Mm-hmm. Did you? I assume you had to have a job while you were in college.
I had to have a job when I was in high school. I worked. I can remember.
I'm trying to turn up the volume a little bit.
I worked in my brother-in-law's store, the Fair store on the east side, which was a general merchandise store.
This was your sister's?
The sister's
Ida's
husband, Ida's husband.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in high school, I got a job as an usher at the Orpheum Theater on Monona Avenue, which later became the Garrick Theater.
Mm-hmm.
It became a stock company. The Al Jackson Players put on the plays every week there, and one of their stars was Agatha Carlin.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the first day she came there. I worked for an usher for a while, and then I went into the box office and worked on the telephones, taking reservations for performances. And I would come there after school when I was in high school. I'd come about 5 o'clock and work through until about 9 o'clock and work all day on Saturday and Sunday.
There were performances every day at the Garrick Theater?
There were performances every day.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a job for me. And
did you make enough to pay your way?
well, yes, of course, I was living at home.
Yes. Mm.
But and I was thinking ahead and saving some money so I could go to college.
Mm-hmm.
And I continued to work all the time. Later on, I used to work summers when I was in college. I used to work for the Adjutant General, Ralph Hillel. I would drive him around the state. I would work in the Adjutant General's office doing clerical work and so forth.
That was the beginning of your political interest, was it?
No, I was interested in politics before that, and my parents were very strong LaFollette supporters. They were very strong supporters of the elder LaFollette, and stood by him during his opposition to America's entry into World War I. So I was brought up in that background, and I was interested in politics right along, did a lot of reading, tried to keep up with it, and would go to hear speeches at the university. And I remember in my early years particularly hearing somebody like Eugene Debs, and how fascinated I was by him. And my parents would always try to come up with money for tickets for concerts like Fritz Kreisler, Misha Elman, and so forth.
That was one of the wonderful things about Madison. All that came here, didn't it?
That's true. But I got interested in politics at an early age, and I joined the Young Progressive Club at the university. And I can remember meeting Phil LaFollette, who came and spoke there one time. And Phil was an instructor in criminal law at the law school. He used to do this while he was practicing law and while he was district attorney. He'd come for this class. And when I entered law school, he was running for governor. That was in 1930. So he was there just for a short time, teaching criminal law. And I was in his criminal law class. And when he was elected governor, Glenn Roberts took over and finished the course.
How was that?
Well, it was okay.
Interesting.
Interesting, yeah. But I was working for Ralph Hillel during the summer, and I told the general that I would like to, this was 1932, my father had passed away in May of that year, but before that I had told the general that I would like to offer my services to Phil in the coming campaign. He said, well, that'd be a good idea. I called Ed Little, who was his Phil's secretary, made an appointment, came up to see Ed Little would like to do what I could. That I usually worked in the summer for Ralph Hillel, but I had saved up enough money so that I could go through a summer without that earning that money. And he said, would you like to meet Phil? I said, yes, I would. So he took me in and introduced me to Phil. I spent about a minute with Phil. And he said, let me get in touch with you. Well, I didn't hear anything. Finally, I got a call. And this was the beginning. I got a call asking if I could drive Phil to Milwaukee and down to someplace in Illinois, northern Illinois, that weekend. And I did. And that was the beginning of our association. From there I went on. He asked me to go with him on the campaign. And I did. I spent the whole summer.
This was in 1932?
1932 on the road in the campaign.
Where Phil was defeated.
With Phil when he was defeated. And he would speak 5, 6 times a day.
Oh.
And my duties were to drive him, to get the meeting started, to distribute literature, to write releases for the local papers. We had prepared releases, but we would have to have beginning with names of the local people, and I would write those and run down to the newspaper office, either the weekly newspaper or the daily newspaper, if it was a daily, and file these releases. I would also each night file by wire releases to Madison, and particularly to the Chicago Tribune, the Milwaukee Journal, and the Milwaukee Sentinel. I'd write those stories. So I was a pretty busy guy.
You had a real busy summer. Were you the only full-time person traveling with him?
Yes, I was the only person traveling with him.
He was governor then? And
He was the governor then.
Uh-huh.
And this took, starting in July, this went through the primary, which was in the latter part of September. And so that was my initiation, and it was a great experience. And of course I also got very well acquainted with Bob Jr., who was in the state, and also speaking every day.
I would like to have you say something about General Immel. What kind of a man was he?
Well,
You don't...
I owe a great deal to him because he kind of looked after me as if I were a member of his family, always checking to make sure that I had enough to go on to school with, and he was a very unusual person. He kept no hours, and he was a great storyteller. He was a brilliant person, and his great capability was getting things done as an administrator, as an executive. And he demonstrated this as the Adjutant General, as the head of the National Guard. He demonstrated it later with what he did in eliminating the terrible forest fires we had in the state as the chairman of the Conservation Commission. And he did quite an unusual job in conservation. Later, he became the head of the Works Progress Administration.
In Washington?
In Wisconsin, which was a federal agency in charge of the works program of the 1930s in this state of Wisconsin.
He's responsible for the state parks and the trails and the...
He is largely responsible for so many of those projects.
Wonderful things that they did.
Yeah. And he was indefatigable. He had no hour schedule, no time limit.
He expected that of you, too?
And he expected that of everybody. We expected that of everybody.
That's where you
Saturday,
got your habit of working 24 hours a
I
day?
guess so.
Well, now let's talk about Phil a little bit. I think it'd be
Mhm.
interesting to have some of the remarkable man that he was.
Yes. And Phil was,
Phil LaFollette, I should
Yes.
say, for the tape, yeah.
and he was a very unusual person, very, very brilliant. He had a mind of unusual acumen. Very, very fast thinking.
Was he like his father?
I didn't know the father.
Mhm.
I really didn't know the father. The only time I saw the father was when he was lying in his casket at his funeral
It was too late then.
in the state capitol, and my mother took me down.
That was 1923
24.
or 24?
My mother took me downtown to the capitol, and we stayed in line. There was a line about 4 abreast for all the blocks around the capitol. We stood in line for hours before we could go by the casket. So I never knew the father other than that. But Phil was very brilliant.
Was he a difficult man to get along with?
No, but when I was with him on the campaign, he didn't talked hardly at all.
He saved all his talk for
He
speaking.
saved all his energy and his throat for speaking. We would only talk when there were necessary things to discuss about the day's routine and arrangements. And I remember having to keep him supplied with orange juice. And in those days, you didn't have cans of orange
So you
juice.
squeezed the oranges.
So I would I'd have to go out and buy oranges and squeeze them and put them in a thermos jug. And after every speech, he would have 1 or 2 glasses of orange juice. And he would lie back and go to sleep. He could fall asleep at the drop of the hat. All this was organized to keep him in shape,
Mm-hmm.
to save energy, to save his throat. But he was, I would say, very easy to get along with, and we got to know each other's personality and habits, characteristics, and so we got along fine. When the campaign was over, Phil realized that he was going to be defeated. I did not.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a greater surprise to me, I think, than it was to him. We were getting big crowds everywhere.
There's a lot of interest that
There was
year.
a tremendous amount of interest. And the farmers would put aside their tasks and take their family and drive into town. And
They weren't making any money on the farm, I imagine. They had felt they had more leisure.
that's right. So we had large crowds, particularly at night. It was not unusual to have a crowd of anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 people at night. And but it was a grueling campaign, and when the returns came through, I was shaken, terribly disappointed by what had happened. But I had to go back to school. See, I had another year of law school. So,
Did you take time out from school?
no,
No,
you
you
see,
kept
because
on.
the primary came near the end of September, and school
Mhm.
didn't start until, I guess, the following week.
Oh, so you had time.
Started late. In those days, it started near the end of September. So I didn't miss any school. So I went back to school, and the next thing I knew, I got a call from Phil. He wanted to talk with me. So we got together, and he suggested that I go to work for his law firm right away.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I had some other ideas about what I was going to do, but he talked me into it. So I went to work for the then firm. It was known as LaFollette, Rogers, and Roberts.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to work part-time during my last year in law school at the law firm. And then came the 1930. I wasn't even admitted to the bar for part of that time. But then came the 1934 campaign and all the events leading up to it, who would run. On formation of the Progressive Party,
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
And before the 1934 campaign got underway,
See, just a second. See. Okay. There we go. Okay, now we're on
before the 1934 campaign got underway, there was extensive discussion about whether to continue in the Republican Party or to organize and establish a new political party. Meetings were called of progressive leaders from around the state who met in groups, and this was discussed pro and con. It was finally decided in a meeting of leaders here in Madison to go ahead with the formation of a party. And
what year are you talking about?
this is 1934.
Mm-hmm.
And then a convention of leaders was held in Fond du Lac, at which this decision was made final. Petitions were gotten out for the new party, and there was a problem as to how it could be done under the then existing statutes. So we had to start an original action in the Supreme Court of the state to get a determination about formation of a new party. And then
Parties weren't part of the statutes at all, were they?
That's right. But in any event, the new party came into being, and the progressive candidates ran as candidates under the banner of the Progressive Party. And that was the year in which Robert M. LaFollette Jr. came up for re-election. He also ran as a progressive for re-election to the U.S. Senate. So we had both LaFollettes running for the top offices in the state. And it was a hard-fought campaign.
Did you have a county-by-county organization?
We had done a lot of work in organizing the state, and we had organizations going in practically every county in the state. There was a great deal of enthusiasm generated, and a lot of work was done. And you must remember we had an incumbent governor, Governor Schmiedman, a Democrat, to run against, who was endorsed by President Roosevelt. In any event, the election came, and this time the crucial election was the regular election in November, not the primary election in September when we were running in the Republican Party. But it was an exciting campaign, and the results were equally exciting, with both Bob and Phil being elected under the new political party banner. And so the Progressive Party was formed. I was in that campaign. Instead of going with Phil, what I did is I stayed here in Madison and ran the personal campaigns of Phil and of Bob here in Madison. So I devoted full time and had to leave the law practice to do it. Incidentally, we used a section of the law firm offices in which to operate.
And the clients didn't mind.
And the clients didn't mind. Nobody objected. And so that was it.
Both your partners were good friends of the LaFollettes.
Oh, yes. The
Mr.
partners were old, good friends like Glenn Roberts, Jack Rowe, whose father had been a partner of the elder Robert M. LaFollette as a lawyer, and Wade Boardman. So Phil became governor, and he asked me to come into the executive office. At first I didn't think I should.
You had then graduated from law school.
And I was practicing. I was supposedly practicing, except for the time I'd spent on the campaign. I had been practicing. But he convinced me that I ought to do it, and I came into the executive office as one of the secretaries and as executive counsel. And I stayed there for until February of 1938.
That was before.
No, that was from, see, Phil went into office then in January of 1935. So I was there a little over 3 years. And those were very exciting years. These were the years of the Depression. And nobody had the view of the Depression and the poverty and hardship that so many people were enduring as we did, sitting in the executive office and getting bag after bag of mail, calls and visits from people who were out of work, who were terribly desperate, looking for some way to keep body and soul together. But I won't go into the details of those years. And
what was the governor's response to the people? Wisconsin set up separate programs? And
Wisconsin, of course, he worked, the governor worked closely with the national administration, the Roosevelt administration, and a works program was set up under the sponsorship of the federal government with the cooperation of the state, and this put a lot of people to work. Phil had also proposed a state works program, but that didn't get through the legislature. But people were put to work, and there were various programs. In addition to the works program, there was the larger public works programs our projects, and there were other projects such as rural electrification in Wisconsin led the way in developing a statewide rural electrification program. Anyhow, a number of things were done, and the conditions of the Depression were mitigated as time went on.
This is till 1938, you got
Yes.
talking about. What made you leave that job?
Well, I felt that I had to get back to the practice of law. I felt that if I didn't, that I would just go on as a political worker.
Somebody's assistant, always.
That's right. And I couldn't see the future in that. I felt that my future and my best qualifications were in the legal field.
That was a very mature kind of a view for a very young man to take in those days.
I considered, and I did go to New York, to consider practicing there. I had an offer from one of the big Wall Street firms, and thought hard about it, and it was a difficult decision. But I decided that I ought to go back to Madison and practice in Madison. And I often wonder what it would have been like if I'd made the other decision.
Well, you'd be terribly rich, probably.
No.
But then you'd be you're terribly rich here anyway, so.
Well,
But it would never have been home.
yeah. So I stayed on here. I went back to my previous firm, which was then called Roberts, Rowe and Boardman, and I practiced there. The war came along. Phil was defeated in 1938, I should say. I worked in that campaign in Madison. Phil was defeated. He came back to the firm as of counsel.
You made this decision before the election, before Phil was
This
defeated?
was made before the election, before Phil was defeated, but I agreed to, and I did devote a considerable amount of time to the election campaign.
As I remember hearing about it, that Phil's group of close friends was very small, and people like you made enormous contributions, but it wasn't a great mass movement.
In what respect do you mean?
Well, I was thinking about the disagreements between him and some of his former followers about the war and about the various ways things were happening, plus the peculiar position that the progressives were in with reference to the National Democratic Party, which Franklin Roosevelt was, after all, a sympathizer and a friend of the progressives.
And Phil disagreed with him, and that motivated him to attempt to launch the National Progressive Party,
Yes.
which proved to be a failure. And
That took place after you left?
that took place after...
You left the government?
Well, let's see, that took place after I left the governor's office,
Mhm.
yeah. And then the Progressive Party started downhill. The Democratic Party got stronger. The Democratic Party in Wisconsin had been a very conservative group, but it was taking on new members and leaders of a more liberal stripe.
Those came along mostly after the war, I
But
think.
those came on mostly after the war.
So when Phil went to the Army, you went along?
Phil went into the service early. I went in later. And I spent 3.5 years in the service, and then came back here. And when I saw Phil in Manila in 1945, he talked about starting our own firm. And I had some misgivings about it, because I liked the people in the old firm. But I finally went ahead with the idea, and he got back here and was discharged in the spring of '45. I went on some operations in the Southwest Pacific and then on to Japan. And I came back in the late fall of that year.
At the end of the war.
After the end of the war, yeah. And I found Phil had a 2-room law office in the Tenney building with the name of LaFollette and Sinykin on the door.
Was that a pleasing sight to you?
So that was a pleasing sight, but it was pretty slow going
Just starting from scratch.
for a while, because I was just starting from scratch.
Now that was 1945. That's 40 years ago.
It's 40 years ago.
Yeah. And you have been a practicing lawyer. You've been the lawyer's lawyer and a practicing lawyer ever since, right?
Right. I probably should mention that my military service overseas in the Southwest Pacific, I was in the 5th plane to land in Japan at Sugi Airfield on that first day during the latter part of August. And I was on the battleship Missouri for the surrender ceremony, and so many interesting things happened in that area at that time. But I came back and I went to work as a lawyer with no practice, and things were tough for a while. And then Jim Doyle came along, and
things were still tough.
Things were still tough. And I talked him into coming aboard, and we would share nothing in the way of fees, because there probably were going to be very little, if any, fees. But anyhow, that was the real start of the firm, which became LaFollette, Sinykin, and Doyle.
I think that one of the things we should talk about a little is your community service since that time. It seems to me there's been hardly a movement in Madison that you haven't been on the board of or chairman of the committee of or something, and all of these variety of things, including Methodist Hospital over here, which turns out to be just an enormous monument that you built, keeps spreading and increasing in size.
Well, I got involved in many things, both in the profession, in the bar, as well as outside the bar. One of the things I got into soon was the Community Welfare Council, which was the sister organization of the United Community Chest, now United Givers. And it was the planning agency for Madison. And I served on the board and served as president. I also served on the board and as an officer of the Community Chest, now the United Givers. And I served on the board and as an officer of the Health Planning Council. I served on the board and as chairman of the board of Methodist Hospital. I served on the board and as an officer of the Progressive magazine. I was on that board for some 45 years. And I was very active in bar activities. I served as president of the Dane County Bar Association. I served as a member of the Board of Governors of the State Bar. I served as president of the Wisconsin Bar Foundation, a sister organization of the State Bar, which Wisconsin Bar Foundation is involved in charitable and educational activities. We call them pro bono services, services for the good of the public. I served as a member of the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association. I served as president and as a member of the board, and I'm still a member of the board, of the National Conference of Bar Foundations, consisting of over 100 bar foundations in the United States and Canada. I served on the...
Nobody's going to believe this, Gordon, when they hear it all, but go ahead.
I think I ought to stop.
No, I don't think you should. I think you should. I think it's important to know how deeply involved people like you can get in a community. Had you gone to New York, you wouldn't have had these opportunities, and Madison wouldn't have had you, which is a very important association.
But these outside activities become very challenging and very, very interesting, and you get to feel that you really can't do without them. So I wonder whether it is something I'm doing for myself rather than for the public.
Probably. You're using your talents, and your lawyer talents and other talents is a public service.
And I have served and am now serving as a member of the Wisconsin Judicial Commission, which hears charges against judges of the state. Well, there are many organizations that I belong to, both professional and otherwise.
It's one of the things that makes Madison a special kind of community, it seems to me, is that there are people like you who are willing to take on these community things. For instance, you were on the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights at the time of the open housing,
right,
and we're one of the spearheads of that. I have done a number of interviews about open housing, and that was a fascinating community effort, which gradually got the support of everybody and finally pushed it through. But you were one of the instigators of that, as I remember. That was the Mayor's Commission, wasn't it?
Yes, the Mayor's Commission on Human Rights. I see that I served as president and as member of the board of the Wisconsin B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation. Forgotten about that.
Where did you ever meet Dorothy, and how did you find time to get married with all of this going on?
Well, Dorothy is a school teacher. She started out teaching in a one-room schoolhouse up in the northern part of Bayfield County. And she lived with a farm family, and she said she just loved it. They were wonderful to her. She came from there to Reedsburg, taught in the high school there, then she came to Madison, taught at Lakewood School. in Maple Bluff, and that's how I met her. I met her when she was in Madison. And so
This is before the war?
this was before the war,
Mm-hmm.
and we were married before the war. Then the war came along. I went into the service in August 1941, shortly after we were married. I also taught at the law school for a couple of years.
What did you teach?
I taught evidence, and I taught torts. And I liked teaching very much, but it took too much time from my practice. And
they don't mind imposing on you. I get it. Both my husband and my son have gone teach one course, and find themselves just absolutely overwhelmed with 80 students and no assistants, and very little pay for your work. Well, now tell me about LaFollette, Sinykin, Anderson, and Munson.
Our firm has gradually
How many lawyers are
grown. I think I didn't count them. The last count, I think, is 21 or 22, with usually several law students. We have 3 law students right now, and 1 or more paralegals.
22 lawyers?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that's a large group. That requires some management, doesn't it?
Yes, and we have had to develop a whole management scheme. In fact, we have now the office manager who takes charge of operating, running the office, hiring the non-lawyers, supervising them.
And you've lost a partner this year.
We lost one partner this year, yes.
And he really resigned and he retired.
He has retired, but Roy Anderson remains on as of counsel, so he will be doing some things from time to time.
Well, that was an interesting, different way of approaching a career, is to suddenly shift gears. Not many people do that when they're well established.
One of the interesting things I've done has been in the insurance field. Many years ago, we talked with the then insurance commissioner, Charles Manson, about overhauling the insurance laws of the state, which were out of date and needed extensive revision. And a committee was set up by legislative fiat to study and revise the insurance laws. And this covered a period of around 12, 13 years. And a very extensive job was done under the leadership of a director of the project, Spencer Kimball, who during the course of the project became dean of the law school.
I want to go back just for a minute to talk about the relations of the various ethnic groups in the bush, the Jews and the blacks and the Catholics. We mentioned them briefly, and also about the splits that have occurred. Why, for instance, were there 2 small Jewish temples in the bush area?
There was a Jewish synagogue.
Not temple, I
We
guess.
don't call it an Orthodox place of worship a temple. We call it a synagogue. There were 2 of them. One was, the oldest one was called well, let me,
There were two of them anyway.
Agudas Achim, Agudas, capital Achim. This was the oldest one. This was in the corner of Mound and Park Street. A group split off from this congregation and formed a separate congregation and built a small synagogue in the corner of Murray and Mound Streets called Adas Yeshurun, Adas, capital Jeshurun. So there were two congregations down there in the Bush area, both Orthodox.
Both had staff, both had rabbis for the...
Both had rabbis, yes. Both had rabbis. And both had services daily and on the holidays.
They didn't come from... The Russian Jews weren't separated from the
No.
Germans or the
No.
Polish or anything
No,
like that.
there was no such separation in this city at this time.
Why did they split? Why were there two?
Oh, just some differences about policy. And I really can't recall what those differences were.
Now, we also mentioned that there was a split in the Catholic, among the Italian people,
Mhm.
which led to the formation of the Italian Methodist Church
Mhm.
as opposed to the St. Joseph
Yeah.
Catholic Church.
The split had nothing to do with doctrine or anything
No.
like that. I know that.
Now, then also we mentioned the criminal activity, the Prohibition time activity in the bush.
Yes,
And-
during the time of the Prohibition Amendment, particularly I recall in the 20s, of course there was much bootlegging going on in the Italian sector of the bush, and people used to come there from all over town to get their liquor.
Were there speak-easies in the bush? Taverns? Whatever? Were there places you could go and knock on the door and peek through a window?
Yes, there were, but I did not frequent any of them
Yeah.
and was not familiar with them. What most of the traffic there was traffic of people coming down and buying their whiskey and taking it away with them in their cars.
And the whiskey came from, I suppose, from the big organizations out of the big cities.
They came from outside the city.
Mhm.
Some was manufactured in the city. But I was very young at the time. But there were two groups or gangs, you might say, down there, according to gossip. And apparently there was a lot of competition between them in connection with this bootleg traffic. And there were shotguns. They always used a sawed-off shotgun killings of people of the Italian vintage during this period of time. And as I can remember, for example, coming home from a violin lesson at night, walking down Murray Street with my violin under my arm, and passing the alley between Milton and Regent Street, and going on home, and 5 minutes later there were some shots, and a person in this house that I passed at that corner was killed. There were a number of these killings. None of them was ever solved.
Mhm.
And
That's interesting that was going on in this integrated neighborhood at the same time.
Yeah.
Were you aware of Neighborhood House and when you were a little child? And
Yes, but it was not used as much as it was later on.
Mhm.
Neighborhood House was on Washington Avenue, right off of Mound Street. And
it sort of concentrated on teaching English
yes,
to the Italian women. And
I never went there, as a matter of fact. Oh, I was in there, but I never frequented or used it.
Mhm.
Remember, we used to have a theater, too, on the
Where?
corner of Washington Avenue and Mound Street.
A movie
A
theater?
movie theater, we called it the Nickel Show. Took a nickel to get in. And,
Were they the kind of movies your mother would let you go and see?
oh, yes, these were, Pearl White
Harold Lloyd.
and Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, so forth.
Well, let me just get one last statement from you. Are you getting ready to retire?
No. I guess not. I am groping for ways and means to cut down so that maybe I can go on a 2/3 or half-time basis. I tried it last year, and for a while it seemed like it was going to work, but it didn't. So I'm going to have to try again.
Try again. Take your fiddle out and start playing.
Yeah, I should take my fiddle out and put some new strings on it and get a bow.
Mhm.
bow. I did try to take it out some time ago and found that it needed new strings and a new bow. And that would be something interesting
Mhm.
to do.
To go back to. Thank you very much.